Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Welcome to the Killer Women podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with over 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Flora Collins. Flora was born and raised in New York City and has never left except for a 4-year stint at Vassar College. When she's not writing, she moonlights as a content manager for a tech startup. Nanny Dearest was her first novel and draws upon personal experiences from her own family history. Flora's latest book, A Small Affair, is out on December 27th. Welcome, Flora.
Thank you so much for that fabulous intro, Danielle.
Well, it was very easy, Flora. Somebody wrote it for me, which is so fabulous. So before I start to gush about how much I loved A Small Affair, why don't you tell listeners a little bit about this book?
Okay, so it is about the perils of online dating. A young woman who is very established in her career or getting up there meets a wealthy older man. They go on a few dates. She breaks things off and then gets embroiled in a horrible, tragic event that he commits.
Yes. So it's interesting. So one of the things I love most about this book, and there are many, is the idea of cancel culture, right? So because of this horrible thing that this man does, which has nothing to do with, our main character Vera, she gets canceled. And it's, that's a brutal for somebody. She's in the fashion industry. It's really brutal for her. Is that part of the reason that was that an interesting aspect of this story for you? And sort of how did you? What made you sort of come to that as a way to punish poor Vera?
No, it absolutely was. I mean, I think when I was writing this, or I began writing it in 2020, so we were very much enmeshed as a culture in this conversation around cancellation. I wanted Vera to kind of be this unlikable bitch, and I wanted to explore how cancel culture would operate with someone who just wasn't inherently a likable woman. So those were some of the themes that I was thinking about when I explored that aspect of the book. I do have, I have empathy for Vera as well. I think that, as you yourself said, she gets embroiled in something that is completely unrelated to her own actions, really. She is scapegoated for a man's actions. And I have a piece coming out on, I'm going to toot my own horn a little bit here.
Yes, please.
Coming out on Crime Reads, which is all about, famous women who have been maligned in the media due to the actions of men. So I obviously was thinking a lot about, our Mia Farrows, Joyce Maynards, Lorena Bobbitt's, like all these sort of interesting women who were ridiculed, mocked, demonized in the media because of the men in their lives.
And then threatened,
yes, all of that.
So I got really excited about this sort of cancel culture, and there's so many parts of that I want to unpack about women and the way women are treated versus men, which I think part of the reason we do the show. I often say, it's not that we don't love men, we do, but it's just there's so much to unpack and explore about women and the way the world treats us differently. How much of that is actually sometimes our own making, right? We sort of do it to each other. We're not always lovely. But what I want to come back to is sort of what was the spark, or can you remember? Because sometimes, of course, these things come to us and we don't really know. But what was the spark of inspiration for this story? Do you remember?
I remember exactly the spark.
Great
question. So I was watching a documentary on Netflix called An American Murder, The Family Next Door, which is about the Chris Watts family annihilation case. Chris Watts was this dad and husband in Colorado who basically murdered his entire family to ostensibly be with his mistress. who was oblivious to, you know, like the fact that he, you know, had or he was, you know, happily, I'm putting air quotes for podcast listeners, happily
Right.
married to his wife. And I was watching this documentary and I turned to my friend and I was like, what would it be like to be this kind of oblivious mistress character in this narrative, in this story? Like that,
Right.
like you know, you're seeing this guy, maybe you feel kind of serious about him, and then out of nowhere you find out he's done the
Yeah.
unspeakable horrific act possible. So
Right. Like
that was
that's gonna want to make you keep dating him, right? He just killed
yeah,
his entire family.
exactly.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. What must that man be thinking? I guess you tried to make it look like an accident or something.
Yes, he reported them. I mean, I like this
Yeah.
documentary is wild for so many different reasons. I have not rewatched it since that first time, kind of because I wanted to like
Yeah.
have my own book be like siloed from it.
Of
But
course.
it's like he reports them missing, and there's all this footage of her, of the wife on Facebook, hawking products because she was in like an MLM, and it just there's so many gray aspects to this case that are both horrifying but also fascinating. Like because
Right.
you know it's so interesting too to have like a whole history and record of a person's life, and that and social media allows that. And it's another thing I you know I get into and
Absolutely. Social media ends up being a very big
Mhm.
part of this as well. And largely because her career really puts her out there, right? I mean, her career, her
Yes.
fashion career and her boss at her fashion company is like, post because you do such a great job, you know, of garnering interest. And it is it's an interesting that even in itself is such an interesting dynamic, right? You have a professional job that you do and you feel like, you know, it's for her, she's not a model. So it's not like she's supposed to be the face of the brand. But yet, because of sort of the aesthetic of her social media, she becomes this like additional face of the brand. And they want that her boss sort of encourages her to put herself out there. And it's like that ends up sort of biting her in the ass too, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
You can't do anything right as a woman online, honestly. Like you just really can't. And I mean, if you're gonna be canceled, then people are just gonna use, and again, canceled is a
mhm,
lot to say about like the kind of heaviness of that word and what it actually means. But
right.
for the sake of the book, to get canceled means that your entire, you know, your entire history is going to be up for grabs.
Oh yeah, and even if you close your account, they've screen grabbed it. It lives there forever. And no, it's whole. I mean, it really. And for Vera, I mean the threats and the danger she. I mean, she ends up having to sort of run to her mother's house in you know, upstate, and that's of course its own it has its own complication because her relationship with her mother is complicated, which, you know, is another sort of factor of being a woman. I think our relationships with our mothers are complicated. But I think to go back to the woman thing, there's a I everybody knows that I make little tabs when I love things. In fact, I one of the things I need for Christmas is more of these little tabs. But I love this line, and it's on 101, and it's Vera, and like you said, I would say Vera is she's not necessarily unlikable to me, of course, because I think women should be able to be brusque and sort of
Yes,
professional.
I agree.
But she is, you know, she does have that sort of impact, and in a culture where women from day one are taught, oh, you should smile. You'd be so much prettier if you'd smile. Like that is what we really need, right? She is not that type of person. So, and so she says here about in response to being harsh. She says, I'm a woman, I guess. Isn't that enough? I'm a bitch and I'm a woman, or I'm a bitch because I'm a woman. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, the behaviors that men display often are really that same sort of like, I don't really want to deal with you. And yet we just brush it off. That's just them being men. But when it comes to a woman doing that, it's offensive. It's
100%, 100%.
and
It's
how do we change that? What the fuck? Pardon my
it's
French.
yeah, it's really I don't have an answer for you, Danielle. And I mean, again, when I was writing this, I had Tom, who's the guy she has the affair with, sort of as the like gendered foil to her. You know, he's this powerful guy who is, you know, constantly praised and very successful in his career because he's kind of like this stoic, like unemotional, you know,
Right.
worker, employer, you know, and I thought a lot about how he and Vera share a lot of qualities, which is one reason why they get along when they
Right.
first start dating, but how, again, those qualities bite Vera in the ass at the end of the day because she's a woman.
And he admires that in her, and I think that's part of the attraction, you know, originally as well, is that, and it's an interesting thing because I do believe that in many cases, men admire the sort of strength of women until, and then there's a certain point at which, if it means that, you know, she doesn't need him, right? Then it becomes less of
Exactly.
he's less admiring of it as he is sort of threatened by it. And that, you know, that's where it sort of becomes a little more complicated. And it's interesting too because his, you know, his wife, Odalie, for some reason
Totally,
that
yeah,
name
you
is
got it. You got it. I honestly, like, I had to listen to, like, I picked that name. It was basically at random. I wanted something that was like very different, and I had to listen to
Me too.
the.
I had to Google it and be like, how do we pronounce this
You're
name?
all good.
But it's a beautiful name. But so Odalie, you know, she's sort of raised in this environment, which again is sort of a thing that happens with women, where it's like you find your job is to look really attractive to find a man, and that is how you're gonna, you know, because they live in this small town, they want to get out. She and her sister, who is another sort of really interesting aspect of this book, and we can touch on it without spoiling anything, but basically it's, you know, that is sort of, that's the option where Tom, you know, creates this company, and you know, he gets to rise on his, you know, on his own. The women, not Vera though, but you know, some of the other women are really sort of faced with the only way to really get out of this is to attach yourself to a man.
Yep, 100%. And I think Odalie also, she lacks a certain kind of strength, and confidence in herself that unfortunately prevents her from kind of being an autonomous individual for a very, very, very long time. And that's, you know, that's kind of a product of her upbringing. I don't think that's a fault of hers entirely. So I'm glad that you, I don't know, you recognize that.
Yeah, and actually I think that's one of the fabulous character arcs, right? Is, and we won't talk much about it, but Odalie does, you know, she does rise to the occasion. So that's, you know, that's fabulous too. And one of the other things I want to talk about is sibling rivalry, because I think this is another really interesting aspect of, particularly I think between, you know, siblings of the same gender, right? We have Tom and his brother. We have Odalie and her sister, and then, you know, Vera has a couple brothers who are actually more supportive. They don't seem to be as, you know, but there is this, you know, this sense of always being compared to somebody else in your family. That is, do you have siblings?
I'm an only child, actually, but I'm really, really fascinated by sibling relationships. Like, I mean, who wouldn't be as an only child? Like, I think they're so
Right.
funny and weird. And I like, I don't know, I think after years and years and years of observing friends of mine and my parents too, and their relationships with their siblings, like I've internalized a lot of like, I guess, dynamics and like, and you know, what makes a kind of good healthy sibling relationship and what doesn't. And obviously, like, serious envy or, you know, attention given to one sibling is always going to create a imbalanced dynamic.
And parents do that. I mean, we do it, and
Yes,
sometimes, you know,
yes.
you know, I am a parent, and I have a daughter and a son, and I recognize now that they're 23 and 21 almost, or anyway, close to that. I recognize the fact that there are things, you know, you do. There's expectations you have of the older child because they're older. There's expectations I have from my daughter because she's a daughter, which is all very unfair. But in the moment you're doing it, you just, you know, you don't really think about it. And then of course later they unpack it for you, because everybody always unpacks things for their mother and explains
Of course,
all the
yes.
ways you messed it up. but it's fair. I mean, that's fair. And I think, I am one of four, and we're two girls and two boys, and I see it there too. It's really, and I can imagine, one of my daughter's closest friends, who's sort of my second daughter, is an only child. And it's right. It's a very strange phenomenon for you to see.
Yes. Because
Since
there's
you,
no comparison for me.
Mhm.
It's like, I have great friends I've been friends with my entire life, but that's nothing compared to, literally sharing like the same DNA as someone in
Yeah,
your
and the parents, and sharing
and parents. Yeah,
the home and the upbringing and all that, the dynamics. Although it is interesting too, to your point, is that actually it isn't quite the same home. It's not exactly the same for that first child, for the second child, as it was for the first
yeah.
child, and for the fourth child as it was for the first child. And I'm 17 years older than my baby brother, same parents, and
Yeah,
we talk a lot about how different my experience, what growing up with my parents was, as my brother Steve's experience.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think your parents probably are different people too. It's like if there's a almost
Of
20
course.
year age difference, it's like they're going to be just different types of parents than they were when they
Absolutely.
had you.
Right. Nervous
Yeah,
first parents versus like whatever, by the time, I mean, and that makes sense. I mean, you can only be vigilant for so long. It's exhausting. So another theme of the book that I really appreciated is the idea of sacrificing something important to get ahead, right? Morals, excusing bad behavior. There's, the town that Odalie and her sister grow up in is sort of a resort town, right? They have a lot of people who come in with a lot of money, their second homes, a lot of bad behavior, and they look down on the locals. Of course, it's very much how these towns work, right? And I wondered if that's something you're sort of interested in exploring, the idea that we look away from sort of the bad things if it means getting ahead, and what do we make of that, right? Is it sort of a necessary evil?
yeah, no, that's a great observation. And I mean, there is that one like paragraph, I think it's in the middle of the book where uh Vera is talking to Paige, who's Odalie's sister, and she's kind of explaining the dynamics of like rich Brooklyn moms,
Hmm.
and how, there's this sort of liberalism that is required while their husbands are, possibly, their husbands who are running banks, etc., are possibly exploiting their workers, damaging the environment. Like there's this cognitive dissonance that's so required to be like an extremely wealthy person in the US today. So I do feel like that I mean that plays a part. That plays a part in sort of like getting ahead. Like if you want to be that powerful and that rich, like you do have to kind of like look the other way about a lot of things.
It is really, that is a really, yeah, that sort of 1%, or even whatever 0.1% is, the people who have so much wealth. And it's true, it's an interesting, that I didn't think about it as such a contradiction, but it absolutely is, that they are liberal, and they a lot of them make wonderful contributions to,
Mhm.
to services that we otherwise wouldn't get, and people need, and that's incredible. And yet at the same time, right, they're not restructuring, their husbands aren't restructuring organizations so that low workers make more money, and they
Right.
therefore take eliminate their multi-million dollar bonuses, and there's none of that, right? It's sort of it's generous, and probably in terms of what the monies that you and I have, it's obviously really generous, but in terms of sort of the real distribution of wealth, it's maybe not.
Right, exactly. And I wanted to correct myself. Like this is not just husbands, it's also women in
Oh, right.
power. Yeah. Like I thought a lot about that when I was writing this, as someone who grew up in Manhattan, which is like, insanely crazy when it comes to insanely crazy. I'm a writer, I can talk well, but no, it's
Yeah,
really
no,
a
I know.
wild place to grow up.
Yeah.
And I went to an all girls school, private school for 13 years. I
Mm.
live in Brooklyn now, in Brooklyn Heights, which is like, you know, basically the I don't know, like the Upper East Side of Brooklyn. Like I've been very much enmeshed in these like circles of wealth for my like most of my life, and it's something that I you know, I like being a fly on the wall, kind of both there, but also observing the again the cognitive dissonance that
Right.
occurs.
Right. And it does feel like, I mean, like Paige, so Odalie's sister comes into the story, you know, when they do sort of when the whole family comes to New York for the well, anyway, when the whole family comes to New York, and Paige is really interesting, right? Because there is this sort of insider outsider thing that is very similar to where the town Paige grew up, and she sort of looks to Vera, who is, you know, who's like you. I mean, she grew up in that, you know, she became an adult in New York, and she feels very much a part of New York culture and understands, although of course she's not uber wealthy, but she understands the sort of dynamics of those groups because of her experiences. And Paige, of course, is new to all of that. And there is this sense of sort of, you know, you don't have, I mean, those groups can be, of course, you know, restricted to the uber wealthy, but there's lots of people who kind of are on the periphery and involved in those groups, but you sort of have to know the rules, right? And there
100%
are, and that's probably true of any, I'm not
any
begging
like
on rich.
culture.
Yes, there is a sort of a, you know, and it's in there, it's the same. I live in Montana, and there's a culture here too, for sure. And so you have to sort of understand the culture before you dig it. And that's a really interesting part of this book as well, the idea of that culture.
There is so much gatekeeping. Like it just like I don't know. I class and wealth, especially in New York City, is like such a strange place because there's also it's almost different from anywhere else, at least in America, because like there's New York is New York, so like you have clout for maybe different reasons than you would in another place. Like if you are in the art, you know, you might not make a ton of money, but if you're very important in the arts, for example, you're gonna, you know, probably brush shoulders with people who are, you know, make hundreds of millions of dollars a year. You know, it's a really interesting context to set a book in, I guess is my
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, and it's your home, so it's like, you know, it's something you
Yeah,
know a lot about. One of the things I also really like is the sort of idea of the big life versus the little life, and there is a point when Vera wonders if what all this that's happened to her is the universe telling her to sort of be quieter and less herself, which I appreciate too, because it's like there are those moments where, you know, something happens to us, we say something, or we get ourselves, you know, or we're put in a situation, or we get ourselves in a situation where all of a sudden it's very uncomfortable, and we think, God, if I hadn't spoken up, or if I hadn't done that thing, I wouldn't be dealing with this. And I
mhm,
like the idea that she sort of always felt like, Vera felt like she was always meant to have a big life, right? And for the first time, because of all of this, she sort of hesitates about that. Um, and so it's a good question. Like, can you live a little life and do, you know, and be somebody who is, you know, seen in social media? And I mean, is it even possible?
yeah. Well, especially if having an audience is important for you to quote unquote get ahead. And I think that's the crux of it, is like if you need followers and engagement and, you know, all these things that come with posting on social media, then like it's you're tethered to your phone, and if you're tethered to your phone, you can't really have a smaller life, I think. Yeah.
Especially if it's your face, right? Especially, I think if it's
Yes,
your face
when it's
that's
your
up
face.
there, then it's
Yes.
really hard, because, you know, that means people will recognize you wherever you go. I mean, I think about being an actor as sort of the hardest possible environment to, well, an actor, and particularly a female actor, because you just like, they can't even go to I can't imagine they can't even go to the grocery store. I know people think that sounds fabulous, but to me it sounds so
No, it
horrible.
sounds, I completely agree. I think it sounds terrible. Like
Yeah.
it's no
Uh,
privacy whatsoever. I
mm-mm,
would not want
mm-mm,
anyone like knowing my, I don't know, my day to day, the way that like these
mm-mm.
A-list celebrities get hounded.
No,
It's
no,
so
exactly. What's interesting too is towards the end, I mean, so Vera's relationship with her mother is a sort of another really interesting aspect of the book. And there's a part actually towards sort of the end of the book when her mother does a little bit of an about face that I really appreciate, because I think as mothers too, and particularly mothers of daughters, we have this mixed emotion of, wanting to protect them and keep them in sort of like a little box so that they can never ever get hurt. And then at the same time, we want them to just, blossom and grow and be. And her mother says that she feels like she pushed Vera to be the kind of woman who took up space, who dictated the space. And I sort of want you to talk about that, because I thought that was a really interesting way of speaking about what her mother had hoped for her.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking a lot about how someone becomes a Vera, like a woman like Vera, and what the parenting style would have to be to become someone like Vera. And I think a lot of it would have to come from the mother, just because, again, as you're saying, moms and daughters, that's a very special, distinct kind of relationship. And I mean, I mean, I obviously love the mother-daughter dynamic. I love exploring it. I think it's like one of the most interesting things to write about. I have like a very larger than life mom myself. My mom was a journalist for Vanity Fair for 25 years, a pretty public New York figure. She is also works in fashion, very much a multi-hyphenate. And I'm like, she definitely instilled this kind of like quiet confidence in me. It's different than Vera. But it's I think a lot about who I am and how I am, today, because of my mom and who she was. And so I don't know. I'm different from Vera. Obviously, my mom is different from Vera's mom, but I wanted to, or I thought a lot about like, I don't know, how we become who we are and how our moms impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, your mom sounds like I don't, it's Vera's mother is she has a lot of her own insecurity, right? I mean, she
Yes.
doesn't seem to
Yes.
have established herself the way clearly your mother has. And so while Vera becomes confident, her confidence isn't sort of that quiet, like inside me
No.
confidence. It's a confidence that she sort of feels like she has to prove all the time. And that, I
100%.
think, is a really different type of
Yes.
confidence. Your mother sounds like she gave you an incredible gift. And Vera's mother, I mean, she did the best she could. And I think actually that is something that we learn about her, all of our characters, right? I mean, no one is perfect and no one parents perfectly. And, we sort of do the best we can do. One of the other things I love about this book, which I keep saying, I'm like, and I love this, and I love this, but there's a wonderful line about rage and women's rage. And there's so much conversation about women's rage and why it is that women have, so much rage, which I think is pretty clear that it's because we take our anger, which, is just where everybody has anger, and we press it down for
Yes.
decades. And then all of a
Yes.
sudden it is no longer anger, it is rage. And there's a line, it's on page 295. It says, "I have so much rage that I could go light a fire with it, extinguish this entire city with one exhaled breath." And I love that, because I think we've all been there, right? We've all been to that point where it's just, you just think, and I thought that's so lovely to imagine, she's like a dragon, right? Like a fire breathing
Yeah.
dragon with her
And
rage.
you're absolutely right. I think that a lot of women cannot tap into their anger. A lot of people who have been gendered as women can't tap into their anger. And I also think when it comes to, even when it comes to like dating or breaking up with people, etc., like I find that a lot of women who date men tend to, kind of be like, oh, it's okay, that behavior is okay, like I'm fine, when what you really want to do is send that damn text being like, hey, you're a friggin' asshole, like
Hmm.
you did X, Y, and Z wrong, like you don't deserve me, and I want to like have nothing to do with you anymore. And I guess I'm saying that like it can be cathartic to let that kind of emotion out. And I feel like even Vera in the book, when she breaks up with Tom, she's pretty like cordial
Yeah.
about it. Even like I mean, not to I'm spoiling my own book, but it's like, you know, she breaks up with him after she hears this vitriol that he has against his ex-wife. And, you know, honestly, what Vera maybe should have done was be like, hey, like, that is a really unappealing quality. Like,
Yeah.
But you know, she even Vera like tamps down that
Right.
kind of anger toward him.
And do you think we do that partially because it's almost a little
Protective.
scary?
It's protective.
Yeah.
It's super protective. But I'm not championing like anger in like
No.
personal relationships at all. But I do think I as a, you know, 29-year-old in New York City, I've dated a lot, and I feel like it's just interesting how specifically in those situations, women, you know, they don't want to seem like they're crazy, so they don't actually express how they're feeling, and that just builds up more and more and more rage
until they are crazy, until we are all crazy. So
exactly.
I love it. So Vera, you know, I really do appreciate her, and I don't, you know, I think there is a shift, you know, in women, in young women, and I like that I really appreciate, and I think that they are bolder, and they're like, I'm not going to deal with that, and they're more resistant to the idea that, you know, that you're supposed to smile because that's what women are supposed to do. And I see that in my daughter, and I see that in young people, and I'm glad for it. I think, you know, it's time.
Absolutely.
It's time. Not to say you can't smile. I think you can if you'd like to, but only if you want to, right? I want to zoom in on the back of your book. I know podcast listeners, you can't see this, but Flora's author photograph is so fabulous. You'll have to go online and look at it when you buy the book. But tell us about that picture. It looks, I was saying,
there's a great story behind that. So I have a family friend called Ike Ude. He is a Nigerian artist, and when he heard I had this book deal, he was like, I want to take your author photo, which was like such a blessing. Like it was like whoa, like that's so generous, like that's incredible. Like I was so honored. So I sat for him, and he took that incredible photo.
It's fabulous.
Kind of a mixed media artist, so like it's a little bit like, I mean, I have it actually. I'm looking at it right now. I have it in my.
You have it hanging in your room. It's gorgeous.
There's a lot of like what's the word, like editing of the color. Which is really interesting. But yeah, you know, it's funny. I have another headshot that is like more of an author headshot, and so depending on like what I'm using, what I'm doing, I give them either that photo or the headshot.
I do. I love it. It's a super cool photo. And that was why when we were talking earlier, I was like, you must be an actor, because it looks like, or it almost looks like vaudeville. Yeah. It's like you're, you know, or not vaudeville, like a burlesque, you know, it's like you're going to go dancing, which is so fabulous. So, well, so it's a small affair. Tell us what is next. What are you working on now, Flora?
I am working on a third thriller. It has not been an option. I mean, I'm in the whole optioning process right now with it. We'll see what happens. I don't like. I feel like I'm just sort of like hoping, but try not to like, you know, think too much about it, be too anxious about it. But yeah, I am working on a third book.
Good for you. Well, you know, having been, my first book came out when I was 29, and I'm obviously a lot older than that now. So having been through the rigmarole a lot of times, I've been where you are plenty of times. And, you know, I think the big thing is to keep writing, you know, and don't let the business get too much in the way of the process and the art and the craft, right? So, but we'll look forward to book 3. And Flora Collins, where can we find you? Where are you on social media? Since we're of course talking about social media.
As Flora Collins _author, and that's my main form of social media. I'm not a big Twitter or Facebook person, so yeah.
Flora Collins. And then do you have a website, Flora?
It's embarrassing, but I don't have a website.
That's okay. I mean, I think it's interesting. Like, as you're a younger generation, you're probably leading the pack in like I'm not doing everything. This is where you can find me. And Instagram is a wonderful spot. So we will look for you there, Flora Collins _author. Thank you so much for joining us. A Small Affair was so
Thank
fun.
you,
Lots
Danielle.
of really fun things to unpack. So everybody should pick this up. It's out December 27th. And I
Yes.
think our episode is coming out the 22nd. So just a few days before your release date. So congratulations on this. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Danielle.
Yeah, thank you. Everybody, this was Killer Women, and we will see you next time. Bye.